publishes this contract along with maybe 40 or 50 other common shipping documents, charter parties, bills of lading, etc. And the reason that this document is important is it's the first time the standard wording has been updated since 1993. And it's been updated because one or two bits of the drafting were weak, but also because sale and purchase transactions are now getting rather more difficult than they used to be, largely due to economic problems. This contract was actually drafted by the Norwegians 100 years ago, or something like that, and it used to be called the Norwegian SALEFORM. And some people actually still know it as the Norwegian SALEFORM, or NSF. In 1956, BIMCO adopted it with the agreement of the Norwegians, and it has been periodically updated. The most recent ones were 1987, then 1993, and this year. Just as a general point, the amendments are not massive. Without doubt, this is the most commonly used form of contract for sale and purchase of ships in the world. There are others. In 2011, in Singapore, they published one called Singapore Ship Sale Form 2011. I haven't actually seen it in use yet, but I'm sure it is in use, particularly in Singapore. Though I have to say it's very closely based on Norwegian Sale Form 1993. Before looking at some of the changes, I thought I would just briefly look at the key points of the structure of a ship sale and purchase transaction. I would be interested to know if anybody here has been involved in ship sale and purchase. Yeah, one, right. Well, I always try and look at it like this. There is a pre-contract stage, which often involves a shipbroker doing some sort of a desktop study of the ship, maybe looking at its history, its classification history, and quite often the contract will then be negotiated and signed, the contract being what is usually called a memorandum of agreement, quite possibly without the buyer having seen the ship. The ship might be on a passage from America to Japan, and it's actually impossible at that particular time, but the seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy, so they sign the contract. And of course at that stage it's a conditional contract. It's conditional because it's subject to the buyer inspecting the classification society records, and if he doesn't like them, he can cancel. And also inspecting the ship when the ship is free from cargo. Once the contract has been signed, the first thing that has to happen within 3 banking days is for the deposit to be paid. Then, as I've said, you have inspection of class records, and then at an agreed period in time, there will be preparation for delivery. The seller will arrange for the vessel to sail to the agreed delivery port, hopefully within the agreed timescale. And when she's there, the seller will issue what's called a notice of readiness, much the same as under a time charter. And the notice of readiness confirms that the ship is in all respects ready for delivery. She is as per the contract. And if she is, the buyer then has 3 banking days in which to arrange for the money to be paid, and of course make the practical arrangements of getting the crew out to the ship. So that's just a very quick summary of the stages of ship sale and purchase. I'll now go through some of the changes that have been made in SALEFORM 2012. I've got a copy of the document here. It's only 8 pages in relatively big print, and so it's not, frankly, a very long contract when you could be dealing with a ship that's worth $50 million. It's a little bit longer now, and I think rightly so. They've changed the ship details a bit. They have also put in, on the first page, a definition section. I'm sure those of you who draft contracts will usually have some sort of a definition section at the beginning, and they're following that logic in this contract now. The deposit terms have been improved. There is now an option on the standard wording to vary the amount of the deposit. Traditionally, it was always 10%. Now, of course, it can be varied. It depends on commercial realities. It also deals with the delivery process in a little bit more detail. Under SALEFORM 1993, there was a cancelling date, but there was no earliest date. So under the new contract, there is basically a range of dates between which the seller must have the ship ready at the delivery port and tender the notice of readiness. So not before a specific date and not after the cancelling date. Perhaps the most important term in the whole contract is clause 11, which is called condition on delivery. The buyer had inspected the vessel 6 weeks ago, before the previous voyage, and it is of crucial importance that the ship is delivered in the condition that he expects it to be, and that the ship is ready to start new employment, earning income for the new buyer. So the condition on delivery term requires the ship to be as is, or rather as was, when inspected, with fair wear and tear accepted. There's no particular definition of fair wear and tear, but that's not something that tends to be disputed very much. It needs to be in class without recommendation or condition of class, with valid and unextended national and other certificates. It needs to be free from damage, or at least damage that would affect class. And the new term they've brought in here, quite logically, is free of cargo and free of stowaways. There have also been some changes in terms of the inspection which happens just before delivery. The buyer has inspected the ship, maybe 6 weeks, sometimes more than that, before delivery. The ship has undertaken another voyage. How does the buyer know that that ship is in the correct condition when you get to the point of delivery? Maybe it's run aground. So it is quite common for a buyer to insist on doing at least a diver's inspection. Sometimes it extends to a full dry docking. And the terms of that, and who pays for it and what happens if damage is found, have been improved. I was involved in one case where there was a dispute over what equipment was to be delivered with the ship. And so SALEFORM 2012 has been updated to say basically everything is included unless the seller produces a list of equipment or spare parts that's excluded. The arbitration agreement has been changed. There's a choice, and you could have an option in SALEFORM between London arbitration and English law or New York law and arbitration, or indeed you could put in anything else. That has now been updated to the standard BIMCO London Maritime Arbitrators Association clause. And then there are some normal terms like notices an entire agreement and exclusion of implied terms, which you would expect to see in any commercial contract, which has now been brought in. Now, there is a danger with a printed form like this, that people think that everything that is necessary is in the form. And as I said, it's a relatively short form of only 8 pages, and it's in fact quite possible that it's not. As a lawyer, I'm quite often asked by clients to review a contract. And the biggest challenge is to work out what is not in it. You can easily read what is in it and see if it makes sense. But actually, you've always got to think what is not in it. And here are, just on this final slide, a few comments about what you need to think about. And the first point, of course, is the financial position of the other party, which Michael has already talked about. The second thing is to properly describe each party. How can you sue a company if you haven't got its full name? I have even, in some cases, suggested that where the other party was a Chinese company, the name of the company was printed in the contract in Chinese letters as well as English. And therefore, if you were suing or trying to enforce in a Chinese court, you could actually go with the contract with the full name. Because otherwise, it is only an English translation. And if the translator wasn't very good, then you could end up with problems. Commercially, look at the amount of the deposit. I've seen 20% deposits. I've seen 5% deposits. It's all up to commercial bargaining. One of the, I think, possibly the biggest problem with the Norwegian SALEFORM is in the inspection and survey clause, which, as it is printed, does not force the seller to open up machinery. So you can look at the outside of the main engine. You're not allowed to take a spanner to it and take bits off and have a look inside. And I think a buyer may well, it depends on the ship and what their technical advice is, may well wish to take a more detailed look at maybe the insides of the double ballast tanks, or to check the coating, or things like that. Because those affect the buyer's right to sue over condition, and it's really, and which are very limited. So it is far better to be safe than sorry. They've updated the list of documentation that is required, but again, as I mentioned earlier with shipbuilding contracts, the documentation is largely going to be driven by the banks. The banks are lending money. They want to be secure that the owner owns, the buyer owns, he gets good title, free from encumbrances, and therefore banks are being increasingly strict on documentation. The last thing that a buyer can do is to sign a memorandum of agreement, commit himself contractually to the transaction, then go to his bank and say, oh, by the way, what documents do you want? And the bank says, well, here's a list of 25 documents, takes those to the seller, and the seller then says, well, we can't produce those. And then you've got a problem. So far better to check with the bank first, and then get it written into the contract. And it's also updated the procedure for the ship mortgages, which can be quite complex when the seller's bank won't release the mortgage until the money has been paid, and the buyer's bank won't release the money to the seller until the seller's mortgage has been taken off. So you have this potential logjam or stalemate. And that has been improved, but it's not perfect. So, SALEFORM 2012 is a definite improvement. You can see a copy by going onto the BIMCO website, go to Documents and drill down to the SALEFORM. Transactions now are very deal driven, so can your company's commercial position be improved, possibly by amending the contract? These contracts should always be reviewed legally and ensure that commercial intentions are clearly set out. It's just a fairly quick review of updates on ship sale and purchase transactions, which obviously, although the numbers of transactions are down from what they were 5 years ago, they still are quite significant, and the values are huge. So I hope that was helpful. That ends the Dale Stevens part. I'd now like to welcome Mr. Kemp, and who I think would like to set up your